when preparing for today, I didn't think I'd really be dusting off my PhD research and revisiting it, but there are two developments in the real world that I feel take me back to this. So the first is the horror that we are witnessing in Gaza. We shouldn't downplay the threat posed by Hamas, but I am reminded of a point by Jacques Semelin in his book Purify and Destroy, when he says that systematic violence against children represents a qualitative leap in violence. The initial attack, there is obviously an arrest warrant out for that by the ICC, led to the deaths of between 30 and 150 children. The response by the Israeli government is around 590. That's not 590 children killed, that's 590 times as many children killed, as there are over 20,000 children killed now. And the second thing I would like to touch on is contemporary academic debates about international order and the future of international order. So this is a screenshot from a recent talk by International Studies Association and EISA, which kind of captures this notion that we're in this world order out of balance. There's been several of these, and a roundtable in ethics and international affairs, and there's talk within these of themes such as populism and nuclear weapons and drones, and Trump has this habit of sucking all the space out of a political discourse. But I would like to connect these two things today as I look back at my own research and say that when we are talking about international order, we should consider the impact that genocide has on international order and feed that into future discussions on international order. Now, it would be very easy not to talk about Gaza today. I'm about 2/3 of the way through a book on mass atrocity prevention in the Central African Republic. But the point of an inaugural lecture is to look back, and I was struck by this recent book, One Day Everyone Will Have Always Been Against This, published by Omar Al-Akkad. And he says in an interview with Christian Guru Murphy on Channel 4, there are no consequences to looking away from Gaza. For the vast majority of people who live in this part of the world, he means the West, if you don't pay any attention to this, how does that change your daily life? It effectively doesn't. The opposite is true. If you stand up and talk about this, you risk your livelihood, you risk your career, you risk being thought of as a troublesome one who doesn't get invited to dinner parties anymore because you make things awkward. But if you just look away, what are the consequences? And to go back to my PhD research, I was asking people to consider the consequences for international order. So a part of this talk today then is looking back at the impact that genocide has on international order, and looking forward, trying to start a conversation about the relationship between genocide, international order, and humanity, and how this should feed into future debates over international order. So just to clarify, I'm not looking at genocide and its impact on the groups targeted, and I'm not looking at how international order itself potentially causes genocide. They're two different research agendas. They're perfectly valid, it's just that that's not where my contribution lies. Now, to illustrate my thinking on this, can I give you a perspective of what I see to be the mainstream view of how genocide impacts on international order? So, 2013, Samantha Power is appointed as the United States Ambassador to the United Nations and visits the Central African Republic in December that year. And the US Holocaust Memorial Museum publishes a report about the response of the US, and they interview a range of people, but they argued that mass atrocities and genocide could destabilize regions, generate massive refugee flows, embolden bad actors, cause economic and resource disruptions, and foment violent extremism, all of which could have a direct impact on the US national security. Now, this is one way of looking at it. And to go back to Ethics and International Roundtable, there's different ways of approaching the study of international order. I see this as more aligned with quantitative studies in that you count the number that have been killed or count the number that have had grave human rights violations perpetrated against them. You count the number of internally displaced. You count the number of refugees that have gone over the border. You begin to look at signalling that to other regimes and make a cost-benefit analysis of how it threatens your national security. That is perfectly valid, but I don't think we could understand the magnitude of the Holocaust by simply counting the numbers killed. There is another way that I'm interested in. To illustrate this, I would like to go to looking at Gaza temporarily. Now, Omar Bertov is a very well-respected Israeli-American historian that's now at Brown. He's born in Israel, raised in Israel, serves in the IDF, and doesn't think it's originally genocide. By the end of 2024, changes his mind and argues that the massive destruction of Gaza means that the entire edifice of international law that was put into place in the wake of World War II and the Holocaust in order to prevent genocide ever happening again, through all these agreements, he says all this apparatus has been shown as meaningless if a country like Israel, supported by Western allies, can act with impunity. And the result of this is that all other rogue states in the world can now say, well, if Israel can get away with this, then why should we not? And so in that sense, this is a total moral, ethical failure by the very countries that claim to be the main protectors of civil rights, democracy, human rights around the world. And apart from the regional catastrophe that is happening right now, this has much larger ramifications for what we will see in the future. I wouldn't go as far as to say that it renders international law meaningless, as I'm studying the law department. Just last week, a 52-year-old woman was imprisoned for perpetrating genocide, crimes against humanity and war crimes in Syria in 2015. These prosecutions often go under the radar, and I think they should be promoted because they're the glimmers of light that we have in this dark world. But it's this bigger picture that I'm interested in. So obviously after World War II, we have what I would describe as the modern architecture of contemporary international order. This is all from an English school perspective, which I don't really want to explain in detail. There's more to international relations than realists tell us, but less than cosmopolitans desire. The English school argues that institutions such as the United Nations and the UN Security Council are secondary institutions, and they facilitate primary institutions such as international legitimacy. The Security Council, in theory, is meant to act as a stabilizing function in international relations, and it oversees international peace and security. There are rules and values and principles set out within this architecture, for example, the UN Charter and notions such as state sovereignty. And at the heart of the Security Council, we have the permanent 5 members. And to go back to Bull, 1981, funnily enough, the year I was born, the great Irresponsibles, if they fulfill duties, obligations and responsibilities, the P5 can be classed as great responsibles. They essentially pursue their national interest, but do so in a way that allows others to pursue their national interest whilst upholding the common good that serves them themselves. But if they act, as they often do, irresponsibly, it can undermine international order. What I'm interested in is at this very same time, we begin to see the crime of genocide constructed as the crime of crimes from a legal and moral perspective in international relations. But it's not viewed as a political priority. And it's this tension that I'm interested in. So the word genocide is coined in 1944 by Raphael Lemkin, for those that do not know. We have the General Assembly resolution that I'll come on to. But really, I think that academics neglect and policymakers misunderstand the impact of genocide on international order. You could argue that policymakers have long misunderstood the impact that climate change has on international order. There are other issue areas you could argue. But essentially I'm arguing that genocide is a threat to international order because it erodes the authority of the UN and the UN Security Council more than any other crime. But to flesh this out further, I need to consider this idea that it's the crime of crimes from a legal and moral perspective. Now, this editor's book came out and it has the thinker behind barbed wire wrestling with this idea, the relationship between genocide, human rights, humanity and God. And the contributions within it kind of reflect on Arendt's argument that groups make up the fabric of humanity, and because genocide refers to the intentional destruction of a group, it is the only crime against humanity for Arendt. Norman Jerris, the third one down, expands this to include what he would say is all inhuman acts. So not just inhumane acts, but he's trying to differentiate between inhumane and inhuman. And he's saying that these constitute a crime against humanity, but he's saying in a non-legal sense, not referring to the legal definition here. For Lang, genocide is a double murder because it destroys the individual as well as the group. You could link that back to Arendt, say it's a triple murder in that you destroy the individual, the group, and humankind, or at least in part of it. And J.K. Roth, who was director of Human Rights Watch for a long time, genocide is the abyss of horror or nothing can be. And essentially, you see such thinking embodied in the mid-1940s in the aftermath of the Holocaust as, for example, at Nuremberg, they couldn't prosecute the Nazis for genocide because genocide isn't written into international law. So how do you prosecute the Nazis when technically they haven't broken any law within Germany? In fact, Arendt said that the law made criminals of them all. So they appeal to this idea of crimes against humanity. Sir Hartley Shawcross, the British prosecutor at Nuremberg, said, there comes a point in a human's life when he must reject the orders of his leader if he is also to answer to his own conscience. In 1946, the UN General Assembly passes the first resolution. So just 2 years after the word's been created, the Crime of Genocide resolution is passed, states that genocide shocks the conscience of humankind and results in great losses to humanity. 2 years later, you get the United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. You can Google it. I won't go into it today, but it stipulates that it recognizes that all periods of history, genocide has inflicted great losses on humanity. So what's interesting here is they decouple genocide from the Holocaust in that they recognize genocide has occurred throughout history, which is exactly what Raphael Lemkin argued. But really, now is the time to come together and codify the prevention and punishment of it into international law, which they did. The US and the UK, the lawyers argued that their government shouldn't ratify the Genocide Convention because it could lead to complex and dangerous foreign policy agendas such as war. I'm happy to talk about that afterwards. States go to the ICJ in 1951 and question the implications of the Genocide Convention, and the ruling, which has been upheld in many, many rulings since, is that genocide has a higher status in international law, and they captured with this idea that it is the crime of crimes, according to the ruling in relation to Rwanda. And just to pick up a more contemporary one, this was invoked by the judge with regards to Palestine. Palestinians saying that the UN has a responsibility to protect these people from the gravest of all crimes, which is genocide. So what I'm saying is I find it interesting. It's not necessarily my personal perspective. I'm not saying genocide is the crime of crimes. I'm interested in the fact that international society has constructed this. So on one hand, they've created international order. On the other hand, they've put this as the crime of crimes from a legal and moral perspective. And this is reaffirmed within political statements time and time again. There can be no more important issue, no more binding obligation than the prevention of genocide. You can find any Remembrance Day, you will find this sort of statement made. a day to reform what our common humanity demands, Obama, but it's not a political priority. There's lots of study that document the lack of political will. Samantha Power, whose life is quite extraordinary in terms of mass atrocity, because she is a journalist that criticises the US, is appointed under Obama, and now is head of, well, until before Christmas, on the ground in Gaza as US aid. She argues that you can't say that American foreign policy has failed to prevent genocide because it's never been trying to prevent genocide. This is circa 2003 at one point. Similar rhetoric within Karen E. Smith's study, which focused particularly on the UK and France. Now, I'm asking you to consider the impact of all this. Now, I think there's two ways of looking at it. One is that these things just don't matter. So there's an interview. So the author is sat at a bar in Rwanda with an American military intelligence officer, and it sounds very flippant, but I think it captures a mainstream view. Do you know what genocide is? A cheese sandwich. What does anyone care about a cheese sandwich? Crimes against humanity? Where's humanity? Who's humanity? You, me? Did you see a crime committed against you? Hey, just another million Rwandans. Did you ever hear about the Genocide Convention? That convention makes a nice wrapping for a cheese sandwich. I'd imagine if you'd witnessed what he'd witnessed in Rwanda, you may also be of a similar view in the questioning whether humanity exists. But what I was interested in and what led me to this research in the first place is the legitimacy crisis that followed Iraq. So this is a statement by Richard Falk, but there's lots of academics have said this sort of thing. The world precedent associated with using military force non-defensively in Kosovo, as well as without a UN Security Council mandate, created a unilateralist momentum that culminated in the Iraq War of 2003. So this was a part of a group of a large body of research where academics would say to understand the invasion of Iraq in 2003, we need to go back to Kosovo. And then another body of academics came along and said, well, to understand that, we need to go back to the tensions within the United Nations Charter. And that's what Ian Clarke's multi-volume study was on, and addressed lots of that. And he was my external examiner. But I was arguing that to understand that, there's a fundamental step missing, and that's the Rwandan genocide. And I don't think you have to look far to get evidence of this, because the UN Secretary General at the time, Kofi Annan, said, think not of Kosovo, but of Rwanda. Imagine for one moment, in those dark days and hours leading up to the genocide, there had been a coalition of states ready and willing to act in defence of the Tutsi, but the Council refused. Should a coalition then have stood idly by while the horrors unfolded? This is a very famous quote, often presented with regards to the sovereignty intervention debate. But I'm saying equally, it should be highlight the problem of authority. You have the leader of the UN questioning the authority of the United Nations. And he's doing it because of the Rwandan genocide and the implications that stemmed from it. Now, I think the responsibility to protect, what I've spent 10 years researching since, was an opportunity for political leaders to fulfill the political responsibility, to come good on this existing legal and moral obligations, and it expanded beyond genocide to include crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing and war crimes, which I think is a positive thing. But writing at the time, Nicholas J. Wheeler said, questioned a victory for common humanity, and was saying, we can't answer this now, but we will know in the future. Well, there's been an awful lot published on the R2P. This comes out in about 10 days. Farewell, the responsibility to protect, false death, grave crisis, future opportunities, by myself. And I'm just, in a nutshell, when one combines the lack of leadership, the complexity of mass atrocity prevention, the unwillingness of states to give up freedom of action, great power perpetrators and enablers that I'll come on to next, the failure to reconstruct the national interests and obstacles posed by regional organisations, the future of mass atrocity prevention looks extremely bleak. But I don't just think that that has impact for the groups targeted, I think that has broader impact for humankind and international order itself. Now, I think something fundamental is missing in the discourse, which is this, that there may be very good reasons why states can't prevent mass atrocities. So, published in British Journal of Politics and International Relations last year with 3 co-authors, Richard Illingworth, Ewan Raffel and Ben Willis, we go through 5 problems that essentially it's very difficult to see how they can be resolved. To give you the most obvious one, the nuclear problem. If a nuclear state is ideologically committed to destroying a group, it's very difficult to see how that can be stopped. To stop a genocide, do you potentially risk nuclear war, which could bring about omnicide, the destruction of humankind itself, which is what I talk about during the Cold War period in the book. But not being able to prevent genocide is one thing. Enabling and perpetrating such crimes is another thing entirely. So, of course, I'm talking about China with regards to Xinjiang, Russia with regards to Ukraine and Syria, and it could be the previous 2 leaders for the UK and the US, but I am talking about Gaza. And what I'm interested in is the implications that has. And if I could just flag 3 of these for us to consider. The first is the moral authority of the permanent 5 is gone. You may question, did it have any in the first place? But to illustrate this, can I take you back to 2016? UN Security Council, Samantha Power is the US ambassador to the UN. She says, we have convened the Security Council today because the Russian Federation and the Assad regime have launched an all-out air and ground offensive against eastern Aleppo and its 275,000 civilians. So she's looking straight at the representative of Russia. She's not mixing her words. I've played this footage to students. It's quite striking. The Assad regime is explicit. It believes only in a military solution. It says it is going to conquer militarily every last square inch of Syria, and it does not care what is left of Syria in pursuing that military solution. Russia will argue today, no doubt, that these attacks are meant to fight terrorism, and the people killed in this offensive are terrorists or terrorist sympathizers. This is absurd. Look at the facts, she claims. It is apocalyptic what is being done to eastern Aleppo. Surely this council can at the very least have the courage to say who is responsible for this and tell Russia with a single voice to stop. I agree with Samantha Power here. My problem is that Russia could sit across from the US on the Security Council now and say exactly the same thing with regards to Gaza. She says that eastern Aleppo looked apocalyptic. Well, this is a photo of Gaza by Reuters taken at the end of last month. They were trying to capture what's occurred after 15 months. The United Nations estimates it will take 21 years to remove the rubble from Gaza. One day, this may be hung in a museum. This is what a mass grave looks like in 2025. When you think over 20,000 children have been killed with death tolls between 40,000 and 350,000, it's absolutely striking. The hypocrisy now involved is quite alarming. The second thing is, it's leading to a more divided world. And we had these divisions previously, for example, over Xinjiang. But now we're beginning to see divisions between Western countries as well. I think this is illustrated with regards to who will comply with the ICC arrest warrant for Netanyahu, as we see lots of European states saying that they will, certain European states, such as the UK and Germany, being more of a grey area. Apologies that I couldn't get a clearer picture than that. And we didn't have the division within the West, between Western governments previously. So this is a new point of fracture developing. And of course, on top of this, we have the South Africa's referral of the situation to the International Court of Justice, with over 30 states in support of it, and the African Union just 2 days ago stating that the Israeli government has to be prosecuted on this, has to face prosecution. There are deep divisions developing within international relations. And Friday, 7th of February 2025, to Trump's approach is to say to South Africa, we will halt foreign aid if you continue to pursue this. And South Africa's rebuttal has been standing by our principles sometimes has consequences, but we remain firm that this is important for the world and the rule of law. I wondered the implications that they're going to be for other issue areas as well. If you're going to need international solidarity for things like climate change, to address the threat of climate change, to what extent can you build solidarity when there's these deep divisions that are linked back to crimes against humanity in a philosophical sense? And the third point of fracture before I close is you're seeing divisions within Western states. Now, to go back to Eikenberry's argument that there's a crisis in the liberal international order, and there's a crisis in the liberal international order because of external threats and internal threats. And he said that liberals never really foresaw that there would be threats for the liberal international order within. And he sees Trump as a threat to the liberal international order from within. But I think here we see another fracture emerging, which is that people are feeling alienated and distanced and giving up on Western governments. So Akkad is questioned about this, and he says, I've been sort of astounded by how many people I've talked to who have a similar sense of alienation. And this isn't a group of human beings who previously felt alienated and now feel more so. I think it's become kind of a breaking point for a lot of people. And public opinion data polling shows that there was a significant shift in attitudes in the UK throughout 2024. And public opinion polling 2 weeks ago in the US shows that 63%, I think it is, opposes Trump's plan for Gaza, and 47% strongly oppose Trump's plan for Gaza. So this will become a deeper issue if he proceeds on this. So just to wrap up, 2 slides. I think that there is a problem of genocide for international order itself. I think academics neglect this and policymakers misunderstand the impact of it. This impact may stem from its special relationship into humanity. Special relationship with humanity, I throw that out there, which underwrites it being viewed as the crime of crimes from a legal and moral perspective. I think we need to factor genocide into debates over the future of international order. That strikes me as there's an international expectation that states should prevent genocide, but a national expectation often that states shouldn't engage in complex and dangerous foreign policies. And this creates a problem for any future international order, which needs to be addressed, whatever type of international order is created. I think it's important to stress that stopping one genocide or mass atrocity is extremely important, because all academics working on this would accept that one of the key causes of mass violence is previous mass violence. So if you can stop this from arising in the first place or break the cycle, you will have a multi-generational positive impact. And just to offer some light in the dark tunnel, folks, one thing when you read this subject matter, it's quite striking just how many examples there are of human beings going to the greatest lengths to protect one another in the most extraordinary settings. Just this book, 30th of January 1997, so like 3 years after the Rwandan genocide, an armed group Hutu come into a girls' school and wake them up and tell them to divide into Hutu and Tutsi, and they refused. They knew what would happen to them. It's one of the most courageous things I've ever read in my life. And they simply refused these labels. They did not see themselves as Hutu and Tutsi. They just, I assume, just saw themselves as human beings and friends. And in that moment, they just fought for humanity from the bottom up. And I think as our leaders fail us, this is kind of the best we can hope for. Thank you very much indeed. Cheers.
Thank you very much indeed.